Schickman Show on this Wednesday. We're very pleased to have as our next guest Dr. Bonner R. Cohen, a senior fellow for the National Center for Public Policy Research, where he concentrates on energy, natural resources, and international relations. He's also a senior policy advisor with the Heartland Institute, a senior policy advisor and analyst with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and an adjunct scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. You may have read a number of his pieces, whether it's in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, IBC, a Washington Times Post, National Review, etc. And he joins us this afternoon to talk about, the pipeline and wind power and other non-traditional energy sources. Dr. Cohen, welcome to the Mike Schickman Show. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It is my honor. I know being on this show after testifying before the U.S. Senate committees is a lot more fun.
Yeah, indeed it is.
I can imagine. This is, and we've seen this along, and the hysteria is rising all of a sudden. The Chicken Littles from the left and from, it's not even the environmental folks, it is actually the environmental religion that has seeped into the public consciousness over the last 20, 25 years. And all of a sudden, because Mr. Trump is going to rein in the EPA, the sky is falling, if you pardon the pun.
Of course, some of us are of the opinion that this particular sky should have fallen a long time ago because EPA has been out of control for decades. It is a de facto lawmaking agency, contrary to what our founding fathers envisioned when they came up with the division of powers. Under the Constitution, the Congress, and the Congress only, is a legislative body that makes laws, which will either be signed into law by the president or vetoed. But we have allowed a regulatory administrative state to come into being whereby EPA, just to cite an example, but other regulatory agencies can do the same thing, issues a rule under a pre-existing law, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, what have you. The problem is that rule has a force of law behind it. And so what you effectively have here is EPA making law. And this has allowed unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats, not to mention political appointees of the previous administration, to run amok and try to impose their particular view of the world on the rest of us, irrespective of what the science says, irrespective of the sometimes devastating effects those particular rules and regulations will have on ordinary American citizens. So I think the Trump administration is really to be congratulated for, at long last, putting an end to this extremely dangerous state of affairs, because we have allowed a situation to come into being where the rule of law means nothing, the Constitution means nothing, and we're under the whim of bureaucrats.
When Richard Nixon founded the EPA back during his administration, this is not what he expected to happen. This was done to provide clean water and clean air, and to let Congress, shall we say, make the law that would do so. Instead, we have grown the EPA over the years, but this was a multi-pronged attack. We also saw the manipulation of children in schools, on children's television, to give them this false information as if it is words from God instead of words from some government agency.
Oh, yes. EPA and other federal agencies have been very active in promoting environmental education, which really means environmental propaganda. And they have succeeded in getting much of this in our schools so that our children, kindergarten through high school, well into college, are given a steady diet of what the education system would have them believe is the truth about the earth, how it came into being, or what constitutes good environmental stewardship, and frankly, they're being indoctrinated and systematically indoctrinated. So it's certainly no surprise that by the time these kids get to college, if they do, they have a view of the world which is completely contrary to nature. They have a view of the world that enables them to be easily manipulated by those who have as their goal the centralization of power in Washington, D.C., which is exactly, sadly, what has happened since, as you said, Richard Nixon created EPA back in 1970.
Well, and it's gotten worse over the last 8 years of the Obama administration because it's as if every non-data-driven environmental and, pardon the Rush Limbauhism, wacko out there to decide that facts didn't matter. Data didn't matter. What mattered was this Gaia complex, and that the Earth was going to go to heck in a handbasket unless the EPA rose to the occasion and dragged us screaming, crying, fingernails dragging along the concrete into this better, greener world.
EPA was corrupt even before the Obama political appointees arrived there in 2009. It had been manipulating science for decades. It had become expert at doing so. It had institutionally brought itself to the point where it was perfectly at ease, scaring people to death in order to justify this or that regulation. When you add political appointees to the Obama EPA, drawn from the likes of the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the Center for Biological Diversity, and all the other usual suspects, and bingo, you have a recipe for regulatory disaster, which is exactly what happened. And the contempt these people have, both for the rule of law, as well as for the principles of science, as well as for the idea that government agencies vested with too much power should use that power cautiously.
But Dr. Cohen,
they use that power recklessly.
Dr. Cohen, they would argue this is settled science.
Well, the problem is science isn't settled on anything.
No, it isn't really
settled on gravity.
It really isn't, and that's what always has. And the first person who brought my consciousness up to this was the former Virginia State climatologist and professor of meteorology at the University of Virginia, Dr. Pat Michaels.
Know him well, good man.
And he said, Mike, you've been listening and reading the falsified numbers of incorrect scientists. And it struck me pretty strong because I had talked to him. Everybody knew and liked Dr. Pat Michaels, and ultimately he paid the price because he was one of the first targets and first victims of the EPA war against, shall we say, counter-science.
Dissenters must be silenced. And anyone who speaks out and calls into question the whole idea, in Pat's case, of human influences on the climate and calls into question the scientific underpinnings of the theory of human-induced global warming, those people are going to be subjected to every imaginable professional intimidation. And in the case of Pat, of course, he paid for it by eventually losing his positions, and he is now at the Cato Institute in Washington, where I can attest, because I saw him last week, he's still plugging away, and of course has been completely vindicated, as have countless other scientists, in pointing out that all the scare tactics of the environmental movement, all the warmist, everything, it hasn't come to pass. Is the theory of human-induced global warming valid? Well, what you do is when you have a theory, you try to validate it by looking at observations, and the observations simply don't line up with the theory. The Earth warms, the Earth cools. It's been doing that since time immemorial, and it will do it again, almost irrespective of anything we as human beings do. It's hubris to think that we can come up with some law or some rule or some regulation that limits emissions of, pick your pollutant, to X, and that is going to affect the climate. that is hubris on an absolutely epic scale. Ultimately, of course, the whole notion of global warming has absolutely nothing to do with the climate itself, but merely serves as a pretext for agencies to accrue even more power than they already have, to put even more money into the hands of already very well-funded environmental groups, to provide a justification for a renewable energy industry. We're speaking here primarily of wind and solar, which can't possibly stand on their own 2 feet and need government handouts to stay in business, which requires, of course, that their competitors, in this case fossil fuels, be demonized, which they have been systematically doing now for 3 decades. And if you demonize something, it can be wind, it can be oil, coal, natural gas, long enough you can justify your subsidy and keep your otherwise non-competitive, quote-unquote, industry in business.
Dr. Bonner R. Cohen is our guest. He's a senior fellow of the National Center for Public Policy Research. We're talking about, and let me ask you this, because it's starting to sound a lot like the little red book of Mao Zedong. Are we going to have like circles of people denouncing each other? Is this all coming as far as people who are against the environmentalists' so-called half-truths? And are we going to have to start deporting ourselves to gulags?
I'm sure that there are many people in the environmental movement who would love to see just that, because they have been colluding with EPA and with other agencies here in Washington for decades. There's a very cozy relationship between those on the outside and those on the inside, and that also includes the media. For instance, the Obama people at EPA knew exactly to whom to leak all sorts of stories promoting the notion of human-induced global warming. And, of course, anyone who called that into question was a lackey of industry, had been bought off by this, that, or the other. And, of course, the whole purpose of the exercise was to shut off dissent, much in the same way that the little red book of Mao Zedong decades ago was supposed to contain everything that a human being needed to know, and anyone who dared question that, well, very unpleasant things happen to them. And you have throughout the scientific community here in the United States people who know quite well what is expected of them when they submit a grant proposal to a federal agency dealing with climate change. They are expected to toe the line. And if they don't toe the line, they're not going to get the grant. And grants are, among other things, ways in which these people pay their mortgages, send their kids to colleges, and what have you. So you have a lot of people who simply engage in self-censorship. They privately may tell you the whole thing's bunk, but publicly they have to keep up a posture because they have bills to pay.
No, Dr. Bonner Cohen, keep up the good work. They can read all of your works at nationalcenter.org, and we appreciate you joining us. Send our regards to Dr. Michaels.
I certainly will.
And come back and join us again.
I would love to.
Thank you. Dr. Bonner Cohen joining us today on WSVA. We've got